For this next session, I'm very pleased to bring on Holly Moon, who's going to be the moderator and facilitator with this next discussion on exploring emerging coaching techniques and practices, all tied to innovation. Holly, at this time, I'm going to turn the mic over to you. I'll see you in 30 minutes. I can't wait to hear what this one comes up with. You guys got so many gems.
Great. Thank you so much. So good afternoon, everyone. As Erica said, my name is Holly Moon. I am the Chief People Officer at the University of Pennsylvania School of Nursing. I also have my own private coaching and consulting practice and work with a variety of different clients. I'm very excited that I get to facilitate this afternoon's session on exploring emerging coaching techniques and practice. During this panel, you'll have the opportunity to hear from two leaders in coaching education. Our time is limited, so I'm going to ask that you put your questions in the chat as they arise, and we'll do our best to address them at the end. To preserve time, I'm going to give a brief overview of our speakers, and then we'll get started. One of our panelists is Dr. Haesun Moon. She is a communication scientist, educator, researcher, and author of Coaching A to Z, The Extraordinary Use of Ordinary Words. She received her PhD in adult education and community development from the University of Toronto. Dr. Moon is the Director of Training Brief Coaching Certificate Program at the University of Toronto and the Executive Director of the Canadian Center for Brief Coaching. We're also joined by Dr. Terry Maltbia. He is a seasoned professional with nearly 40 years of diverse experience as a sales professional, sales management, external and internal organizational effectiveness consultant, thought leader, educator, and researcher. He received his doctorate from Teachers College at Columbia University, and there he is an associate professor of practice in the Department of Organization and Leadership in Teachers College of Columbia University. And he is currently the faculty director for the Columbia Coaching Certificate Program. Haesun and Terry, welcome. We're very excited to speak with you this afternoon. I know both of you are passionate about the coaching education space and have a lot to offer to us today on this topic of emerging techniques and practices. So to get us started and set the stage, could you talk a bit about the trends you are seeing in coaching right now? And Terry, I'll pass it to you and then I'll toss it over to Haesun. Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on where you're logging on from. You never know what you're going to do. I heard a lot about trends in some of the earlier conversations, so I'll just build on those. So anyone that has ever heard me speak knows I have sort of this meta framework that's the science of human performance. So I think of coaching education as a form of human performance. We're working with individuals. And the science of human performance says, in order to understand any human phenomenon, you have to understand context, content, and conduct. So for me, I'm really using that idea to situate the idea of trends in our work of not only coaching education, but specifically executive and organizational coaching leaders, and doing that in a work context. So in addition to looking at the studies that we all look at from professional associations like ICF or think tanks such as the Conference Board or Corporate Leadership Council, and of course being in academic journals, one of the things that I find really helpful is to really look at what eventually our participants from our program, what spaces are they going into, and what are those leaders? So if we're interested in leaders, for example, one of the sources that I look at every year is the Conference Boards puts out a C-suite outlook report. And I love the title this year because it was Reset and Reimagine. And if you think about what's happening in the world, we are certainly in that space. And so just as context, I'll repeat some of the things we've already heard. Global pandemic, we've all been there. We're finding our way through it. And I think it's proven to be more of a marathon than a sprint. as sort of the headline to sort of think about that because it's still here. And that triggered a number of other trends, some of which were new, some of which were amplified. Everything from economic uncertainty, new and emerging work markets. I found a piece of data that was interesting research that said pre-pandemic, organizations were already exploring remote workers, about 28% on average. During the peak of the pandemic, that jumped up to 80%. And CEOs, based on this 2022 study, are projecting that even as we work our way through the marathon of the global pandemic, they're expecting that to be 40%. And so one could say that the pandemic has served to actually accelerate or amplify a trend that we were already exploring. So as an educator, we had to go through that parallel experience. We happened to have a program that was largely in person, what I would call a sequential hybrid, largely in person. Then we had a component that was virtual, and then we had a component that was face-to-face again. But never did we have to do all remote or now hybrid. We're concurrent hybrid, where we now actually have people that are in the room with us and virtually. So I would say the two headlines for us has been adaptation and agility. Social unrest, another trend that, in the United States, a lot of that was triggered by George Floyd. We see racial protests, political divide. I think I heard Charlene mention, or someone mentioned recently, we're at our midterm election. So that certainly amplifies that reality. Environmental concerns. And so my broader context is higher education. And so we are dealing with pressure for the high cost of tuition, whether it's for credit or non-credit. And so now being forced to think about how do we deliver our offerings in a way that continue to sustain growth. What we have found is at the forefront, so to me, this is really the trend, is we've always thought that learning climate was important, but we're really expanding that idea. And I just discovered that there's a term and a series of research on it that we're exploring. But this notion of experience management, or I would say as an educator, crafting the experience, being really intentional about crafting that experience. And so involving the things, fortunately, that we do well as a coach, listening, understanding to take informed action. But really experience management means doing a lot of surveying. And so, and from three perspectives, one is our customer perspective for us as the student or the participant. So really looking at what effort is required to engage in experiences with us, what is the emotional impact, and how are you and others defining success. So really being able to operationalize this notion of experience from our participants' perspective and use that to drive and inform the way we listen to them, the way we seek to understand them, and of course, take informed action. Brand experience, given that and the elements for brand experience is the elements of trust, appeal, and values. And so how are we living that? What we have known prior to the cohort, prior to the pandemic, is we rely very heavily on referrals. And so not only do we have to, the integration between the participant experience, i.e. the student experience, and the brand experience are almost the same. And then importantly, the service experience. Like we are offering a service called education. And so how useful is it? How reliable is it? And importantly, how are we integrating innovation? So just building on so there are three sort of big ideas, and my time is almost up in terms of framing it. But we are having to think a lot more. So I'm just name three big things related to those external trends. We're having to think a lot more about pathways, i.e. what happens to our participants once they leave our program, and are we tracking that, and are we measuring that? And so we are now integrating to the program thoughts about trends like third-party coach providers. When we started the program, most people wanted to be independent coaches. The market is shifting and shifting in a big way. And so how do we help people begin to think about that? Expanding coaching modalities. When we started coaching program, the industry and us, was really focused on one-on-one coaching. If we look at the ICF study or others, they have talked for over a decade about external and internal practitioners and managers using coaching skills. But we understand that as we start beginning to think about scaling coaching in organizations, that the modalities are also scaling: peers, groups, teams, and integrating coaching to other strategic initiatives in an organization. So that means that we as educators and programs have to expand our knowledge base, because most of what we were drawing on in coaching were at the individual or interpersonal level. But as we begin to expand the modalities, we have to expand the levels, and from individual to group to organizational. The role of technology, I won't get into it in detail, but we are exploring and experimenting on not AI as replacing coaching, but how AI and coaching are working in partnership. So doing some pilot programs with some really fascinating technology. One, I don't know how many of you have heard of it, but Evita, which is a video-based platform, for example, that is the coach and the client goes right there. And within, if it's a 10-minute conversation, within 20 minutes, you get a recording that has some very useful data that implies for both training and supervision, like number of open-ended questions versus closed-ended questions, like how much time did you spend talking, coach, versus the client. It also can track key moments. And so it's not replacing me as an educator. However, all of us have done supervision. We need to give them those sort of rudimentary things. But actually, this program does it better than I do. And it allows me, to have more space to do things that, number one, I prefer to do than counting how many open and closed-ended questions they're asking, but I know it's important, but also to do the things that are uniquely human that the machine can't do. So that's just a quick example of that. And then I think another big thing that we have to pay attention to in the coaching field, which I actually think was a blind spot, was the role of race and identity and diversity, equity, and inclusion. That profession is certainly, the diversity, equity, inclusion profession is much further along than we are as a profession. And in fact, many of our client organizations are further along with that than we are as a profession. So lastly, I was just inspired by the last presentation, and someone asked the question, how do we convert some of these wonderful things like art to technology? And so this is an example. This is a program called Padlet. And so I don't know how many people have heard of Visual Explorer, but we used to do this with cards in a room and so on. And we might, for example, say, if we're thinking about sort of getting a coaching agreement based on the topic, where are you now? Where do you want to be? And we would do that talking. We can still do that talking, but then also ask them to select an image that reflects where they are and where they want to be. And where we used to do this manually, we now have converted this to using a digital platform where there's a little video that shows them how to do it. The participants can click one card, and what we used to do manually, we can now do virtually. And so I'll end there. Let me stop sharing my screen if I can remember how to do that.
That's great. Thank you, Terry. What would you add to the trends list, Haesun?
Trent, by the way, I just noticed that I'm wearing the same sweater as my profile photo. I love it. I have the same sweater in like 3 different colors, and today happens to be the yellow sweater. So anyway, so I think, I'm a researcher, so I look for patterns. And I think earlier, Carrie talked about how we look at standards or patterns and so on. And here's a question for all of you, actually, as I do this research. Now, I think all of us are here related to a topic that's something to do with the coaching. And then now, how do you know that your client is making a progress? So that's my first question to you. And then you might have some answers like, oh, I know because this and that. And then my second question to you might be, how do you know that your client progress has anything to do with you? And that's one of the key questions that we look at when we study coaching. And there are some patterns or trends actually in coaching education that I've seen in the last, especially about 15 years, or we can actually go all the way back to 40 years. But traditionally, somehow coaching has been taught as a question-based intervention. So some of you, I know you have coaching question cards. And then you have these cards, oh yeah, ask the next question. Your future is one question away. So those ideas were there early on. So coaching as a question, and that was a huge trend, which is not evidence-based. So surprise. And I guess second trend on a micro level, as Terry is talking about this macro level trend, I wanted to offer this micro level of trend that we see in coaching based on communication science. Another one is, if you want to know if your coaching is effective, obviously you need to look at the effect of coaching. But then oftentimes what we do is we look at the session, not the effect of the session. And we think, yes, we're doing coaching research by looking at what do you do as a coach? So we interview coaches. Hey, what do you think that you do? And then we look at the tapes. As Terry said, we are videotaping all these things. And then let's see what you're actually doing. And how do you know that what you're doing is actually useful? How does it work? How do you know that that's how it works? And these are the questions that we're just posing for people to reflect on. Because if we say, how do you know? Like, what do you think you do? We get some answers. Well, I provoke, I challenge, I encourage, I listen, all these things. And then next question is, how do you know that's useful? How does it show up? And that's what we do in communication research. And I guess another small pattern, which is not so small, is how we evaluate coaching effectiveness. And we have tons and tons of outcome research. We ask people, was it useful? Yes, it was useful. We have like amazing outcome research. Clients are satisfied. And I don't even know how you do ROI, but they do. And there's ROI and it shows like 257% increase. And we're like, how did you know that? We guessed it. No, research doesn't work like that. So I've talked to a lot of researchers around this. And how do we bring this communication research to process research? Because we often look at coaching process as a psychological internal process, but actually it's a sociological and interactional process. And how does our research actually reflect that reality? That is a co-construction. It's an interesting idea, by the way, the word conference. The fur in conference, it means to carry or to bear a child. So when you conference, we need to be co-constructing or making fruit together, so to speak. And I am so interested that, we just come to speak, but then I also would like to hear from all of you about what you think is how coaching works. And that's a beginning point of our next conversation, isn't it? So I just wanted to sort of offer that to you. By the way, the fur in offer has the same meaning as conference, inference, difference, suffer. And it's really interesting to actually look at that. So I guess the trend that I would like to see more is seeing coaching as less of a psychological process, but seeing it as a sociological, sociolinguistic process. That's what I would love to see more, how we use language.
Wow, very fascinating from both of you. So Terry, I'm also in the higher education space with both of you, and it's interesting, the shift of universities have been these brick and mortar things. And we had to figure out, just like many industry did, to lift and shift our coaching practice and education online. And it's the same thing that coaches are doing. We so much believed in this psychological in-person approach to coaching. And now many of us are using that coaching practice virtually via Zoom in sessions like this. And so in terms of education and how we're doing this and the videotaping and this, I'm curious about what you're seeing in terms of impact. And this is kind of going to both of you. Haesun, you talk about the impact and how do we know it's working? That transformation from in-person education, in-person coaching to now this virtual setting of coaching and moving into these sociological processes. What's really the impact of that and how do we know it's working?
Well, I'll even take it back a few steps.
Sure.
So I think, yes, I think we went from largely in person to virtual, and it's not, I would say, at least in our world, it's not even largely virtual or in person. If we did one or the other, our enrollment would drop dramatically. So we have been pulled into hybrid and concurrent hybrid. And so doing it at the same time. So that to me is even more complicated than in person or virtual. But I would say that there is a psychological aspect to this that's different, I think, maybe than what we coaches have had to deal with, or maybe more amplified. In the educational environment, we realized during, those of us who even weren't therapists, we realized that a lot of our students, we were all experiencing a co-traumatic experience called COVID, and we were doing it at the same time. And one of the things the university did really quickly is draw on our School of Social Work to help us understand the indicators of trauma. And I have to say that as an educator, I was embarrassed, because as I was learning about the indicators of trauma, that I realized that I had students who were experiencing trauma in my classrooms pre-pandemic. So I think because of the uncertainty and the fact that COVID is more of a marathon than a sprint, and it's disrupted our lives in so many ways, that we are dealing with a higher incidence of participants and students who are entering our learning spaces with trauma. May not be severe as we would normally think about it, but so having trauma-informed practices and interventions, and it's beyond the scope of what we're talking about here today, but I would just put that as a point that I think no longer can I isolate that work to psychologists and therapists and so on, because it's in my classrooms, it's in my learning spaces. And so I think this distinction that we in the coaching profession have tried to draw for decades about coaching is not therapy, coaching is not facilitation, coaching is not teaching, whatever it is really a false distinction, because our learners are entering, and COVID, if nothing else, taught me that our learners are entering that space as whole people, heart, head, and hand. Sorry about that. So anyway, I'll pause there for a second and let my colleague contribute.
And I just want to say, I think that's really interesting in terms of trauma-informed coaching and what you're saying, because I practice yoga and I'm seeing a lot of trauma-informed yoga practice now, which is very interesting as a discipline as we talk about what's emerging in this space. And so that word trauma is popping up in other spaces.
And what the university said to us very clearly is you can no longer leave that work exclusively to, quote, the professionals.
Yeah.
That you must be positioned, and we must arm you
Yes.
to be positioned to learn how to recognize and at least do early interventions in the moment. Because if you wait for the referral, it might be too late.
Yeah, so true. So true. Haesun.
And I think in a way too, that trauma-informed practice actually is, I think there's distinction between trauma-informed and trauma-driven. And I think in research, we look at trauma-informed as something that will lead you to that compassion, and that, that is, the name escapes me, this professor. She talks about how trauma-informed is about calling in practice, and then how trauma-driven is calling out, I'm going to call you out. And then that only perpetuates violence and silence that has been actually perpetuating. So it's so interesting that we hear that, because a lot of leaders actually bring up that issue of trauma-informed practice. How do I do that? And it's quite practical, actually. So one leader actually said, we no longer actually require perfect attendance. We actually have a safety room. So if you want to come into work and just sit there, then just sit there. We encourage that. And it's very simple, actually, in practice. And I think when we talk about these trending words, and I really hope it's not just a trend, trauma-informed practice, I really hope it's the practice that stays. But another one that we talked about is how we use language very intentionally is as Terry, you're talking about this COVID times, we had this huge thing about social distancing, and every time I hear it, I cringe. It's physical distancing, not social distancing, for example. That's how we use words, because words, the way that you use it will create that meaning. And for example, I'm going to actually challenge the word diversity, for example. And it's really important work, but I think that word is getting in the way. So when you call something diverse, then what happens is if you invite diversity to a party, they always come with a partner called norm. It's because it's a diversion from a norm. So what we might be doing right now, if we are not aware of the work that we do or the language that we use, we may be shifting around the norm, but perpetuating the same violence and silence. And I challenged at one of the conferences last week. I said, when we talk about diversity, some people may feel uncomfortable speaking up still, including straight white males. And is that okay? Are we perpetuating what has been going on? And that's a very controversial issue. But there's another wonderful word to replace that. For example, it's multiplicity, or multiple legitimacy by Dr. Kenneth Kurgan, who actually speaks about social construction and how words create meaning. If you invite multiplicity to a party, they come in multiples. There's no norm. And multiple voices need to be legitimate at the table. How do we create that dialogic condition, relational condition? And that's why I'm seeing in the chat, I love these conversations about which perspectives need to come to the table, because so far psychological perspectives have been so useful and so prevalent. That's amazing. Now, who else needs to show up? So sociology, linguistic, and there are so many other perspectives that need to come at the table. And how do we create that condition is my question to all of you educators and researchers here.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And we need to think about, how do we do that, right? Because coach training has been done in these other aspects, and you're inviting a very different facet of training that maybe doesn't exist in our programs, and what that might need to look like. I saw someone say restorative practices and these types of things are really important. And we've always done whole person approach, right? And we are kind of seeing trauma come up. But what are the strategies and practices we put into the classroom to really help coaches manage the sociological perspectives?
There's a lot happening in the conversation. Just going back a step to Haesun's point, I do think psychology has certainly dominated the field of coaching as a profession, and yet the work that we're doing both as a practice and contextually is multidisciplinary, almost by definition, because we are communicating. So there is a psychology aspect of that, but there's also a discipline, an academic discipline and research around communication. There's also research we're talking about learning. And there's decades of work on how adults learn and so on. So I think we've always dealt with a multidisciplinary approach. I think we have to be more explicit that it is, and that we have privileged largely psychology compared to some of the other disciplines. But by definition, the actual work itself requires that we draw on multiple disciplines, whether we want to or not. Anyway, I don't know where we are.
Maybe if I can add to that, Terry, too, is that I also see in the chat, how do we create that condition or a psychological safety, for example, in classrooms, Holly, as you're asking, is that many times when you feel evaluated, you don't feel safe. But that's what we do in classrooms. For some reason, we evaluate rather than value. So if somebody's leaving your classroom evaluated, I'm not sure if that's useful for their learning, but if they leave your classroom feeling valued, I think that's where they will continue to learn. They're curious and they want to do more about it. So the way that I do that, I changed this entire coaching pedagogy about 10 years ago. So now I don't teach much, but I start with, what questions do you bring? And even before I introduce any idea, I just say, hey, let's go record your baseline. Your job is to simply try your best to be useful in the conversation for your partner. We're going to videotape it, and that's your baseline before you learn anything. So they record their baseline, and it's hilarious. You know, after like 3 weeks, we go back and we're all laughing about it, how horrendous it is. And that's the whole point of making it safe. So they do the baseline, and we actually do video recording throughout the course. And then afterwards, we compare their tapes, what you were doing in your baseline, and this is what you're doing 6 weeks later. When they see their own progress, my goodness, that's what we do for our clients. Our clients, they get to be reminded of their existing progress, and they realize, hey, I'm better than I thought. And how do we actually create that congruent process for our students? And for me, using those videotapes and looking at their own work and their own progress, that seems to really do the trick. So that's something that I am so proud of, actually, in terms of coaching education and how it's changing.
Yeah, I love the idea of having a baseline. We do literally the same thing, and I think it's a great idea. I just want to pick up on something that draws on a conversation that we had earlier, not with us, but early in the conference, the notion of challenge and support, or support and challenge. I think psychological safety is the support side of education. And it can have, if that's our only focus, an unintended consequence, that we don't prepare our students for the reality of needing to be brave. So I think we have to create both psychological safe spaces, but also brave spaces within a learning environment. I think it's the educational parallel to challenge and support. So I don't disagree, but I think coaches actually attract humanists and people who love that space. And we send them into the big bad world that's not that. And so I think ethically, we have to really build into our educational practices both psychological safety and being brave, because I think succeeding in this world, not only surviving, but thriving, requires building both muscles.
So using these tools and teaching them in the classroom, and ultimately coaches can then employ those tools with their clients, right? Both in terms of psychological safety, but also, Haesun, as you just mentioned, this video recording, right? You're using that with your students, they're recording, you're showing them their progress. But if you're meeting with a client on Zoom, there's no reason why you can't record sessions and they can't see their own progress and go back to those. And so these are tools that we take in the classroom, and ultimately the coaches can be using those connections in their practice as well.
I'm just looking at, I think it's Michelle Bennett's comment about how can we help people feel valued if they're getting feedback. And I think part of it, again, beyond the scope of what we're talking about here, but I think part of it is even our experience with feedback, right? Feedback is a necessity. We have been helped by it and we've been hurt by it, right? Almost all of us, right? And so part of it is to really expand what we mean by feedback. And there's a number of wonderful tools and frameworks around that, like feedback receptivity, right? And so it's not necessarily that the feedback that we're giving people is good or bad, always. Sometimes we haven't helped people nor assessed one's actual level of receptivity. So is that really a feedback problem, or is that another issue? So I think just really expanding our notion. So feedback receptivity is, you can just Google Scholar it, and there's some great assessments around that. We use that because we do give feedback in the program. So it's really important that people in some ways expand their relationship with the idea of feedback. There's feedback environment, which is less necessarily about individual level feedback, but what needs to happen at the environmental level. And there are factors. You can Google Scholar feedback environment and see what those factors are. So I think it's really integrating all of these ideas into our curriculum, because one thing that we've come to believe, that climate before content. Learning climate before content.
Yeah.
And I guess, Terry, with that too, learning culture, we talk about culture a lot, but culture is really nothing more than accumulation of micro conversations we have.
Mm-hmm.
And those micro conversations, I mean, there's enough research that also shows the minute we hear the 6 words, can I give you some feedback? You respond like you hear, footsteps approaching you in dark alley at night. It's our natural response to, can I give you some feedback?
Mhm.
Then we learn to say, yes, please, I would love to have some feedback, but is that our really natural stance? And thinking, I have a quick story, because whenever we have, let's say, new staff joining and there's probation period, you all know what it is. And at the end of probation period, or, during the period, they are being interviewed or evaluated. So then we actually do a completely different approach at my center, because we believe in making people feel valued. So when manager and staff, they sit down, the manager will begin by saying, so how did I do as your supervisor to support you in the last 3 months? Now that's a completely different approach of probation, and you should see the staff member's face. I mean, they knew that question was coming. They're like, what? I thought you were evaluating me. But then it's same for the supervisor. And supervisor will then ask, so what did you find really useful that I did, or, around you, that really supported you? And also the third question is, what would you like to see more or less of, so that you can really thrive in this workplace? It's a completely different way of actually working with the people. Same in nurse education classes. This amazing nurse who's been a nurse for 40 years meets this new student right out of university. And she is like, okay, so tell me, what will be useful for me to learn about you? And then the student's like, oh, that's kind of cool. And they talk about it. And about a particular skill or a topic that they have to learn, the nurse actually said, so what do you already know? So that I don't have to repeat. And I want to learn what you are learning in school, because you must have something new that I need to learn. And then the third question the nurse actually told the student was, what is the best way to learn this? How would you want me to actually show you? And that's what we mean by taking coaching approach in education as well, so that we actually assume that we don't know. We may know the subject matter, but we don't know how they do their life. So I think that's how it shows up in a very tangible way. So I just wanted to add that feedback is a topic that I really care about.
Agreed.
Yeah,
Agreed.
just very briefly, because Jonathan put something in there about developmental approaches and feedback. A pitch. Ellie Drago Severson wrote a wonderful book on feedback called "Tell Me So I Can Hear You," and it's really a developmental approach to feedback, which deals with the integration of challenge and support in the context of feedback from a developmental perspective. So I'll throw the link in the chat once we finish talking here, because I can't multitask very well.
Thank you. Thank you. Such a rich conversation. So many things that people have here in the chat that they want to hear more about. And we're definitely not going to have time for everything because there are only 5 minutes left. But Terry and Haesun, is there anything you see in the chat that you just want to kind of respond to before otherwise beyond following up thereafter? And I don't know if you've gotten to. I see one. Haesun, you talked about one level of evaluation, but how do you know outcomes in life in terms of coaching? How do you know the coaching is working when with the students, and knowing when they take it into that practice as a coach in the coach's life?
What I can do is I can actually share a chapter that I've written, so you can read about this model that we use, so that people have this heuristic of interaction that they can use when they're watching their own tape. And it's a research tool, but people find it so useful. So I can actually post in the chat and then you can all read it, and hopefully you will use it too. So maybe I can do that. So teaching people how to, I think we earlier talked about how do we teach people how to learn, or how do we learn to learn? Yeah. And I think that's one of the tools that we actually have. So I can share that here.
And we will be sharing a resource room for everybody who's registered for the conference. If you'd share that with us at GSAEC, Asher and team will make sure that it gets posted for everybody to be able to access when we provide that link, and continue to update it with the resources that are being mentioned. This is excellent. Thank you.
There's a question here that they were hoping for a comment on. So question regarding research based on session recordings. We need to look beyond coach behavior to coach client interactions that lead to demonstrable shifts in awareness of behavior in the session. Thoughts on that? It's from Gordon.
I'm sorry, I was reading the chat. I didn't hear the question.
I can take it first, Terry.
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
Yeah, and behaviors of interaction. Now, so when I do supervision and stuff like the mentor coaching, people say, oh, that client was just so resistant. Now, that's an impression of a client. Then I say, okay, well, let's go back to that interaction and let's see and hear what happened there. What did you hear or see the client say or do for you to say the client was so resistant? So we usually go back to that moment. And when we look at it, you know what, Gordon, what happens usually is client says something and then actually coach then adds something to what the client didn't say. And research shows that's where the client is more likely to say, you know what, not quite, no, yeah, I'm not sure. And then we perceive that as resistance. But quite frankly, what happens is, well, you just added your own words and the client doesn't like that. It's not resisting. Client is telling you, no, that's not my world. So that's one example of how we interpret certain things, but that you can really see description of what is actually happening rather than interpretation of it. Oh, there are so many studies about gaze window and all those facial gestures that are so in sync when we're communicating. So yeah, Gordon, thank you so much for the question, actually.
So thank you. I think I understand the question, having heard you respond. So thank you. Yeah, coaches, we humans use a lot of characterization frames, and it's a lot easier for us to use labels, you're resistant, etc. And I think it's an easy, not easy, but there's a quick patch for that, which is I'll say, what did the client do exactly that led you to the belief that they're resistant?
And I'd like to throw out an innovative and thought-provoking idea also in terms of the background with neuroscience and resistance to change, that resistance is often a good sign that they're finally beginning to work on the really root of what most needs to change for them to accomplish what really needs to go from a much deeper systems level, which means they're probably now going deeper than what's being happening on what they thought was the surface change that needed to happen. So just to put an innovative idea out, resistance doesn't always have to be negative. As a coach, it's often a very good sign that something's starting to work.
And it is, Erica, I think what you're highlighting is that when I say that the client is resistant, that's actually more about my relationship to resistance and challenge and conflict than it is what's going on with the coach.
Terry, pulling that in about our own practice as a coach could be another 3 hours. Just that comment alone could take us off in another direction.
To your point, having someone said, I started in sales, actually, we know from sales that people do not resist things they care about.
Mm-hmm.
So think about that for a moment, right? If the client is being resistant, coach, to your point, you're now in the zone. So know how to work with that, know how to use it. If you can't work with that resistance, frankly, you can't do deep work with clients.
So on that note, everyone take that and start deepening and reflecting. I want to give us very, very rich welcome and thank you on a deep level to Terry and Haesun and Holly, your excellent facilitation and moderation of this discussion today. How so good. Look at all the chat going on. We're going to take a short break again to let all of this marinate. There's been so much richness for today. We're going to take a short break until 0:00.